Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you for responding to our invitation. Today, the Board of the Central Bank decided to reduce the refinancing rate by a quarter percentage point, setting it at 9.5%. So, Mr. Galstyan will now present the press release, followed by Q&A. Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon.
2023 թվականի
It's October 31, 2023 meeting. The Board of the Central Bank decided to reduce the refinancing rate by a quarter percentage point, setting it at 9.5%. In September 2023, the 12-month CPI inflation rate increased, reaching 0.1% by the end of the month. The 12-month core inflation continued to decrease. By the end of September, it was minus 0.1%. In recent months, there has been a definite acceleration of domestic demand in main partner countries of the Bank of Armenia. At the same time, due to geopolitical developments, uncertainties related to global economic growth and geopolitical developments and volatility have increased. The 12-month inflation rate remains above target levels in Armenia's partner countries. And in these conditions, the central banks of partner countries will continue to conduct contractionary monetary policy. As a result, there will continue to be weak deflationary effects on our economy from the external sector. In recent months, the Republic of Armenia has experienced higher than expected economic activity, which continues to be supported by high growth in the construction and service sectors. Together with this, domestic demand continues to expand, given the weak deflationary effects from the external sector and the implemented contractionary monetary policy. The inflationary environment remains low, which is also reflected in the slowing of wage growth rate in the labor market. In the current situation, the Board of the Central Bank considers it appropriate to reduce the policy rate. The Board will continue to be prudent in ensuring that adequate actions are taken to regulate demand and stabilize inflation expectations. In the outlined monetary policy scenario, the 12-month inflation rate will remain below the target level in the near future, and then gradually increase and stabilize around in the midterm around the 4% target. The Board of the Central Bank assesses that the risks of deviating of inflation from the planned trajectory are mostly balanced. In the event that any risk materializes in either direction, the Board will respond accordingly and ensure the price stability objective. Thank you. Arka. Mr. Galstyan, I wanted to ask a follow-up question. Yesterday, the National Assembly exposed legislative initiative which by the end of this year or next year will be deliberated upon in the National Assembly with respect to cryptocurrency. Could you dwell on at least the main targets, provisions and ideology thereof? With your permission, I'll refrain at this point from expanding on it. I'll tell you why. Yesterday I mentioned that we intend to submit it end of this year or early next year, but we have not yet discussed it with any of the partners, so it won't be appropriate. It will be better if I first discuss it with our colleagues, and then we will, of course, share with you the purposes, the goals, the substance, and the content of the bill H2. Mr. Galstyan, with your permission, two questions. Do you have estimates which sectors have undergone increased activity or fall thereof? And about 100,000 displaced residents of Artsakh, their presence in Armenia, what will the consequences of that be? If we get back to that slide, you will see that the green line is our current program. I apologize, the gray one is the current, and the green line is the results of monitoring, which what we intended for this meeting. Essentially, you'll see that the growth has been higher than expected in the services sector, To a certain extent, there is a decline in agriculture, but from the overall GDP perspective, we expect it to be quite high this year. At our next year, we will also submit to you our most recent projections for this year. As for our compatriots from Artsakh, and the question you asked in that context, in the press release I mentioned, and the last time, if you remember, I also dwelled on the expanded domestic demand. Our estimate is that as a result of this recent developments, the assistance and financial expenditures that the government has incurred and will incur to assist our compatriots displaced from Artsakh will also contribute to expanded demand. If we look at the more conceptual side of the question, how does this reflect on monetary policy and inflation, we should distinguish between two periods: what will happen in short term and mid-term and long-term possibilities. In the short term, naturally, the government will extend support to Artsakh. There are mechanisms of targeted assistance, 100,000, 40 plus 10,000 drums. All of this will contribute to increase domestic demand in the short term, and if we fail concurrently with the increased domestic demand to create conditions for the displaced Artsakhis to get integrated in the labor market and their daily lives, apparently we will have an unchanged or limited supply with the impact on the potential GDP being limited, whereas demand-wise we will have expansion, which may result in certain inflationary phenomena. So two things need to be considered and done here. Most important, the integration of Artsakh should be organized in such a way as for them to be employed in productive sectors and create added value, and in the short term their burden should also of course be eased until what I just described will come about. Thank you, Mr. Galstyan. Yesterday you also mentioned that the potential increased demand is associated with capex, and the KPIs for the 6 months were unprecedentedly low in view of the non-financial sector transactions. It's just slightly above 50%, that is only. So, maintaining your contact with the colleagues from the executive, do you receive signals about possible improvements here from them? And do you receive any signals about the following: facing big volumes of public procurement in construction mostly? Will the construction companies adequately or consider in the near horizon 2 or 3 months to invest in their equipment and boost their productivity? Thank you for the question. As for this year, we also acknowledged, and yesterday I mentioned it at the National Assembly, that there is a certain capex under expenditure. Assurances by the executive are that the most expenditures will take place in Q4 this year, which will somehow mitigate the trend. It's very important since the next year capex project is quite ambitious, 6.6% if I'm not mistaken. It's very important to properly organize it. So when the question was asked by the colleague about the Artsakhis, we know that in the labor market there are certain shifts also taking place, and it's important to utilize the potential of these people in the context of programmatic implementation of these capital expenses. As for renewing the equipment and hardware. You know that the government has comprehensive and expanded subsidies programs for this. We believe there will be companies that will take continual advantage of this opportunity. The question is beyond our scope to some extent, but let's hope that they will be able to organize work in such a way as for us to have both production and issuance increase, which will preclude the situation whereupon we will have a positive gap in the GDP, which will naturally result in higher inflation and certain response by the central bank. 160. I have several questions since it was already mentioned about the Artsakh Armenians. In the same context, what about their liabilities and the commodities they pledged with the banks? Do you have a common vision with those commercial banks as to how this issue is going to be resolved? Especially that the civic contract MP Bob Gentunyan recently reflected on another issue in the same context. I quote, "The government of the Nagorno-Karabakh owes Armenian banks a lot of money." We're talking about in excess of 200 billion drams. Has the central bank discussed this issue, and what recommendations or decisions do exist? Understandably, if this is left on the banks themselves, that will create an issue. Some specialists claim that if it's left up to the bank, they will try to speculate between dollar and dram to offset and compensate for these amounts. So I have follow-up questions as well. The last part really baffled me, quoting some sort of specialists. I'm not aware of these specialists would imagine that the banks speculate on such a scale as to offset anything near the amounts you mentioned. I rule that out. Of course I do. It's not possible to speculate as a result of which the banks will earn the amounts in the neighborhood of what you mentioned. It's absolutely unthinkable. And the second emphasis is the stability of the financial system of Armenia at this point is not in jeopardy. Nothing jeopardizes. There is a natural process underway in the course of which we, the government, the National Assembly and the banking sector will discuss and arrive at a reasonable solution which will allow to get the best solution in the current situation. So it hasn't been discussed yet. At this point there has not been a final discussion that I could possibly report reliably to you. One more question with your permission, Mr. Galstyan. According to the grapevine, the Georgian company has bought a share in Ameria Armenian Bank. Could you affirm or deny it, whether it's true? And if it is, which Georgian company are we talking about? Who are the beneficial owners thereof? And whatever other details the central bank has. Let me request you one thing, with your permission, of course. Let us elevate this discussion to a more professional level and discuss those subjects that are hinged on monetary policy, because that's the leitmotif of our discussions. And secondly, don't put the governor of the central bank in a situation to discuss grapevine issues. The central bank at this point is the institution which registers or approves transactions like that. As soon as the transaction happens, quite naturally, everyone will be duly informed. So no such transaction has taken place. None. Mr. Galstyan, considering also the character of today's press conference, IMF, World Bank, Central Bank, 2024 economic indicator has been estimated between 4.8 up to 5.6. What determines the optimism of the government? Have you discussed with your colleagues in the government what the basis for this optimism may be? and how do they factor in the concerns and risks that you have acknowledged in the basis of your estimate. We do hold these discussions every year, and within the recent years you may know that essentially we do not make projections, we submit scenarios of development, and the numbers that our government colleagues have, same 7% for the last 2 years economic growth. 1 year it was 12.6, this year it will be close to 7, maybe even over 7 we believe. As for next year estimates, our 5.6 is determined by the following factor. It's extremely important, as the colleague mentioned, to have an adequate course of implementing capex through the year. Another important factor is the extent to which the colleagues from the private sector, seeing the government implemented public capital expenditures, will also become proactive in their projects and will go for new investments. In the course of the year we have several scenarios, and over time we share our mindset and share the full vision. Since the year hasn't even kicked off at this point, considering the fact that there may be some under expenditures in capex, as well as not being aware of the private investment plans, we try to lean on the more conservative side than our colleagues in the government. Over the course of the year, life demonstrates that being conservative over the last couple of years was not very realistic, but this way rather our calculations and estimates come to prove that there will be good economic growth. Essentially 5.6 is a good number. Sputnik. Mr. Galstyan, I wanted to ask about the components of this projection. Is it net exports, imports, government consumption, private consumption? It looks as though the economic fundamentals do not change, and in your most recent projection that's also acknowledged. Economic growth continues to be based on non-production sectors, and industry along with agriculture are gone into the minus. So the basis that we had on the expense of these sectors no longer allows us to have annual growth, and it's because of the high baseline that the next year economic growth will slow down a little. Let me answer, then I'll give the floor to Haika Vetisyan. The work of all of us and the ideas that we try to implement, our objectives are to converge on increasing productivity. This is an axiomatic truth, and there is an alternative to it. Essentially, in the services sector, one may also have a growth of productivity, and services may also be exportable. We see that since over the last couple of years we had expanded external demand through the non-residents. It's obvious that the services that the non-residents take advantage of in the Republic of Armenia are exportable. So how did the quality of these services improve, or the productivity in this last couple of years? Well, one needs to see yet. We also have substantial developments in the IT sector. For years on end, the growth rate in the IT sector was quite high. As for the structure for 2024, Hike will dwell on that. If I remember it correctly, we've already published that. Anyway, thank you. In general terms, when it comes to next year's growth structure, there will be no substantive changes. The trends of 23 will carry onwards. So it will be services, construction, as well as to some extent there will be positive development in industry, but quite naturally our projections of slowed growth over this year will be the trend, which reflects the fact that in 22 onwards to 23 the demand contributed to economic growth in services and construction. This will gradually be adjusted. The high demand which we had in 22-23 reflected in services and construction will gradually, and we already see that end of by Q3-4 of 23 are getting adjusted. That's a normal process, and this is essentially the result of our monetary policy. The surplus demand, as one may say, is gradually getting adjusted, and for 24 we will get close to the structure of the economy, whereupon the demand mostly will have been adjusted and be close to the normal economic potential. Let me just add, with respect to the preceding question, the 7% targeting by the government should be taken as a just what it is, a target. It's an objective, and the basis for it, an important one, is implementing capital expenditures, and it's as a result of that implementation which from 5.5 may elevate it to 7. That's a good and positive targeting, and there are clear projects that will lead there. If I may ask such a question, statistics has not reflected yet September developments in the forex market and structure of bank deposits. Have you noticed that in the last 10 or first 10 October and first 10 days of as a result of aggression unleashed by Azerbaijan, has there been a flight of dollar-denominated deposits from the banking systems in a scale that may have affected the forex rate in the long term? I have the numbers for end of September right here, and if we look end of September this year, what shall we compare it with on a monthly basis? To make it more salient, we have 0.7% growth in resident deposits. As for forex demands, the demand for forex deposits by legal persons have increased by over 4%. Time deposits of legal persons have grown by 3.7%. Natural persons demand for forex deposits have increased by 4.7%, and time forex deposits have increased by 0.8%. So we cannot identify a trend of flight of forex deposits now. The overall deposits over the same period of last year, the resident deposits increased by 25.2% at fixed exchange rate, moreover, and the non-residents 16.8%, 17. So this is net of the fluctuations of the exchange rate, yes. About the demand component, consumer loans continue to grow since early this year. The last accessible data is of August, but there's been 15% growth in August over end of December. Is this trend continuing also in September? And if the interest rate restricted the demand to some extent, then what did determine such a growth? Of course, if it persevered in September. Essentially, we have in end of September 23 the data according to which the consumer loans to residents have increased by 18.9%. That's a healthy, good indicator. Year to date. As to what may determine this, it's determined by increased incomes, which still continue to, in certain sectors, to grow. This is also determined by the natural cycle of our growth responsible sectors. If people take out a mortgage and buy property, quite naturally, after they take possession, they have to furnish, repair, decorate interiors, make it livable. So my assumption is that as a result of this natural behavior, and we have of course factored that in our previous press release when we're talking about certain increased demands domestically, that was exactly what we had in mind. So we believe that in the course of this year we will observe supply in credit products, healthy growth rates, and if we compare it with last year when the financial sector income or the banking sector income was mostly because of the services to non-residents, over this year we observed that the loan products also have a significant demand, therefore, and will create an opportunity and will provide an opportunity for the banking system to get returns. With your permission, the expected meeting with the Fed, according to your perception or prediction, will they take a break or will they increase the rate? If they do, will those risks materialize more of the flight of dollar-denominated assets onto the developed countries? That's not my projection, it's the market projection. The majority expected that during this next Fed meeting the interest will stay put, which means the Fed has resolved the issue. Does this mean that they have resolved the issue of inflation? Not in the least. The last one was 4.9% economic growth, which is quite a high indicator, but the tension is still there in the labor market of the United States. Essentially that results in specialists concluding that the recession they predicted for this year may roll over onto the next year. Do we assume that the Fed will conclude its cycle of tightening? I would believe not. And if this warming process goes on or worse accelerates, I think the Fed has its hands free to carry on. In this respect, I believe that they have some unfinished work yet, which is the reason why the specialists have the so-called higher for longer thesis that they subscribe to. As for our residents investing in dollar-denominated American assets, you never know. We will monitor the situation. The risk premium that exists narrows down to some extent, so we'll see which behavioral ramifications will be by our residents. We closely monitor that, by the way. Mr. Galstyan, you talked about a bill on crypto being drafted. You mentioned that the best practices globally will be enshrined in it. Which countries? EU. You maybe covered that, maybe I missed. Did the commercial banks seek any support or concessional loans with respect to the possible material or financial loss they had sustained in their Artsakh branches? Did they do it individually or through the Association of Banks? To the best of my knowledge, no governmental support was sought by them at this point. They have initiated it out of their own goodwill to help our compatriots from Artsakh. Accounts are being set up, cards issued pro bono, no service charges for setting up card accounts. Cards are issued for free, and at this point in time they are trying to also help natural persons who owe the banks. To the best of my knowledge, this is a universal effort, not by just individual banks. There are banks, I assume almost all of them, that have even turned off SMS notifications for the late payments. Not to unnerve further people in dire psychological straits. So they're doing their best within their means to be of help. Thank you.